The morning light filtered through the heavy curtains of Kensington Palace, casting long shadows across the polished floors. William stood at the window of his private study, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the world outside continue its relentless pace. The city of London buzzed with activity, unaware that within these walls a storm was brewing that would soon engulf the entire nation. Kate sat in the corner armchair, her usually vibrant eyes now dulled with exhaustion. She had barely slept, in weeks, and the weight of recent events pressed down on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. The silence between them had grown thick and uncomfortable, filled with all the words they couldn't bring themselves to speak aloud. Their marriage, once a fairy tale that captured the world's imagination, now felt fragile, like glass ready to shatter at the slightest touch. The phone calls had started early that morning, first from Buckingham Palace, then from Downing Street, and finally from news outlets around the globe. Everyone wanted answers, statements, reassurances that everything would be all right. But how could they provide comfort to others when they themselves were drowning in uncertainty and pain? William turned away from the window, his gaze falling on his wife. He could see the tears she refused to shed, the way her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the morning newspaper. The headlines were brutal, invasive, and completely wrong about what was really happening behind closed doors. The press had painted them as the perfect couple, immune to the struggles that plagued ordinary families. But the truth was far more complex and heartbreaking. Kate looked up at him, and in that moment, he saw everything she had been trying to hide. The fear, the disappointment, the crushing weight of expectations that never seemed to ease. They were supposed to be symbols of hope and stability for the British people, but how could they fulfill that role when their own world was crumbling around them? The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 9 times, marking another hour in what would become one of the most difficult days of their lives. Staff members moved quietly through the corridors outside, their hushed conversations adding to the sense of impending crisis. Everyone could feel it, the tension that seemed to seep through the very walls of the palace. William walked slowly toward Kate, each step deliberate and careful. He knew that whatever happened next would change everything, not just for them, but for the monarchy itself. The burden of their positions meant that their personal struggles could never remain truly private. Every tear, every argument, every moment of weakness would eventually become public property, dissected and analyzed by millions of strangers. Kate shifted in her chair, making room for him beside her. The simple gesture spoke volumes about their relationship. Despite everything they were facing, they were still trying to find ways to support each other. The love that had brought them together years ago was still there, buried beneath layers of protocol, duty, and public scrutiny, but fighting to survive. Outside, the first protesters had begun to gather near the palace gates. Their chants were still quiet, but William knew they would grow louder as the day progressed. The British people had invested so much hope in their marriage, seeing it as a fresh start for the royal family after years of scandal and disappointment. Now that hope was being tested in ways no one had anticipated. The irony wasn't lost on him, that in trying to protect the institution of the monarchy, they had perhaps damaged it more than any scandal could have. The very secrecy that was meant to shield them had created an atmosphere of suspicion and speculation that threatened to consume everything they held dear. Kate finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, asking the question that had been haunting them both for weeks. William looked into her eyes, seeing his own fears reflected back at him, and realized that the time for silence had passed. The door to their private world was about to be opened, whether they were ready or not, and the entire nation would witness what lay beyond. The decision came suddenly, like a dam finally bursting after holding back months of pressure. William stood up from beside Kate, his movements sharp and determined. He had made up his mind. They couldn't continue living in this suffocating bubble of pretense and carefully managed public appearances. The truth, however painful, had to come out. Kate watched her husband walk toward his desk, knowing instinctively what he was about to do. Her heart raced as she realized there would be no going back once he made that call. The private secretary's number was already programmed into his phone, waiting for this moment that they had both dreaded and somehow anticipated for months. The conversation was brief, but loaded with implications that would ripple across the Commonwealth and beyond. William's voice was steady as he spoke, but Kate could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his free hand clenched and unclenched as he delivered instructions that would change their lives forever. When he hung up, the silence in the room felt different, charged with possibility and terror in equal measure. Within minutes, the palace machinery began to move. Staff members who had been tiptoeing around the couple's obvious distress suddenly found themselves with clear directives. Press releases needed to be drafted, security protocols reviewed, and contingency plans activated. The carefully orchestrated world of royal communications shifted into crisis mode, even though no one outside the inner circle yet understood what crisis they were managing. Kate rose from her chair and moved to stand beside William. For the first time in weeks, they were truly united in their purpose, even if that purpose felt like stepping off a cliff together. The weight of their decision pressed down on both of them, but there was also a strange sense of relief. The exhausting performance of normalcy could finally end. The first sign that something momentous was happening came when additional security arrived at the palace gates. The crowd outside, initially small and curious, began to swell as word spread through social media that unusual activity was taking place. Reporters who had been covering other stories suddenly found themselves reassigned to what their editors sensed could be a major development. Inside the palace, Kate found herself thinking about their children, safely away at school, unaware that their parents' world was about to explode into public view. How would they explain this to them? How could they protect their innocence while still being honest about the reality of their situation? The questions felt overwhelming, but there was no time to find perfect answers. William's phone buzzed constantly with messages from family members who had clearly been briefed about the impending announcement. His father's concern came through, in terse, formal language that barely concealed deeper emotions. His brother's message was more direct, offering support while questioning the timing and necessity of such drastic action. The media response was swift and intense. News vans began lining up outside the palace before the official announcement had even been made. Social media exploded with speculation and theories, each more dramatic than the last. The public's hunger for royal news, usually satisfied with carefully managed photo opportunities and official statements, suddenly faced the prospect of genuine, unfiltered truth. Kate walked to the window and saw the growing crowd below. Some held signs expressing support, others looked angry and confused. All of them were waiting for answers that she and William weren't entirely sure they were ready to provide. The British people had elevated them to almost mythical status, and now they were about to reveal themselves as painfully, completely human. The afternoon brought meetings with senior palace officials, each more tense than the last. Advisors who had spent years crafting the couple's public image now found themselves scrambling to manage a narrative that was about to spin completely out of their control. The usual scripts and protocols were useless in the face of what William and Kate were determined to do. As evening approached, Kate found herself looking at her reflection in the ornate mirror of their private sitting room. The woman staring back at her looked older, more fragile than the confident princess the world expected to see. Tomorrow, everyone would know the truth about what lay beneath the polished exterior, and she wasn't sure she was strong enough to handle their judgment and disappointment. The night before the announcement felt endless. Kate lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to William's restless breathing beside her. Neither of them could sleep, both knowing that dawn would bring a fundamental change to their lives and possibly to the monarchy itself. The weight of history seemed to press down on them in the darkness, reminding them that their personal choices would have consequences far beyond their family. At 3 a.m, William quietly slipped out of bed and padded barefoot to his study. Kate followed, finding him standing before the portrait of his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, that hung above the fireplace. In the dim light, she could see the conflict etched across his features, the struggle between duty to the crown and loyalty to his own truth. His grandmother had weathered countless storms during her reign, but none quite like the one he was about to unleash. They talked in whispers until sunrise, going over their decision one final time. There were moments when doubt crept in, when the magnitude of what they were about to do threatened to overwhelm their resolve. But each time they wavered, they remembered the months of pretending, the carefully staged public appearances that felt like elaborate lies, and the crushing loneliness of carrying their burden in silence. The morning brought a flurry of final preparations. Kate's stylist arrived early, tasked with creating a look that would be scrutinized by millions and remembered for decades. Every detail mattered: the color of her dress, the style of her hair, whether she wore jewelry or kept things simple. These choices would be analyzed and interpreted as symbols of deeper meanings, whether she intended them or not. William met with his private secretary one last time, reviewing the statement that would soon be released to the world. Each word had been carefully chosen, but he knew that no amount of preparation could control how the public would react. The British people had invested their hopes and dreams in his marriage, and he was about to tell them that even fairy tales could have complicated endings. The children were brought to the palace earlier than usual, pulled from their normal school routine for what would be one of the most important conversations of their young lives. William and Kate sat them down in the nursery, surrounded by toys and books that suddenly seemed to belong to a simpler time. Explaining adult complexities to innocent minds felt like trying to translate poetry into mathematics. Something essential was always lost in the process. Their son asked direct questions that cut straight to the heart of the matter, while their daughter seemed to sense the emotional undercurrents even if she couldn't fully understand them. Kate found herself fighting back tears as she tried to reassure them that some things would change, but their parents' love for them would remain constant. William's voice caught slightly as he promised them that family would always come first, no matter what the newspapers might say. By noon, the palace was buzzing with an energy that felt both electric and ominous. Staff members who had worked there for decades said they had never seen anything quite like it. The sense that history was being made in real time, that the careful traditions and protocols that had governed royal life for generations were about to be challenged in ways no one could predict. The first draft of the evening news was already being written, based on speculation and rumors that swirled through London like wildfire. Social media was ablaze with theories and predictions, each more dramatic than the last. The hashtag that would define the day was already trending, created by users who had no idea how accurate their guesses would prove to be. Kate stood in her dressing room looking at her reflection one final time before facing the cameras. The woman in the mirror looked composed and dignified, but she knew that everyone watching would be searching for cracks in the facade, for signs of the vulnerability and uncertainty that she was working so hard to conceal. The formal announcement was scheduled for 4 o'clock, but already the world was holding its breath. International news networks had interrupted regular programming. Heads of state were being briefed by their foreign ministries, and millions of people were refreshing their news feeds obsessively, waiting for confirmation of what they sensed was coming. William adjusted his tie one final time and took Kate's hand. Together they walked toward the door that would open onto their new reality, one where their private struggles would become public property, where their pain would be shared by an entire nation, and where the fairy tale that had captivated the world would be revealed as something far more complex and human than anyone had imagined. The moment William's hand touched the brass handle of the door leading to the press room, time seemed to slow down. Kate squeezed his other hand, a final gesture of unity before they stepped into the storm they had created. Behind that door waited dozens of cameras, reporters from around the globe, and questions they still weren't entirely sure how to answer. The press room fell silent as they entered. Seasoned journalists who had covered royal events for decades found themselves unprepared for the raw emotion they could see in both William and Kate's faces. This wasn't the polished, rehearsed appearance they were accustomed to. This was something unprecedented, authentic, and deeply unsettling. William approached the podium with measured steps, his years of training in public speaking warring with the very personal nature of what he was about to reveal. Kate stood beside him, close enough to offer support but far enough away to maintain her own dignity. The clicking of cameras filled the silence, each flash capturing what would become historic images. His opening words were simple, direct, and devastating in their honesty. The fairy tale that had captivated millions was fracturing, not because of scandal or betrayal, but because of the very human struggle to balance personal happiness with public duty. Kate's composure finally cracked slightly, a single tear rolling down her cheek that would be replayed endlessly in the days to come. The questions from reporters were sharp and probing, each one designed to extract more detail than William and Kate were prepared to give. They had agreed to reveal their truth, but they still had children to protect, family relationships to preserve, and their own emotional well-being to consider. Walking this line required every ounce of their diplomatic training. Kate spoke for the first time 20 minutes into the press conference, her voice steady despite the emotional turmoil visible in her eyes. She talked about the pressures of public life, the challenge of raising children in the spotlight, and the weight of expectations that never seemed to ease. Her words were carefully chosen but deeply felt, offering a glimpse into the private struggles that had been hidden behind years of perfect public appearances. Outside the palace, the crowd had grown to thousands. Some people wept openly as they watched the press conference on their phones, feeling as if their own dreams were being shattered along with the royal fairy tale. Others expressed anger, feeling betrayed by what they saw as a failure of duty and responsibility. The reaction was as complex and divided as the emotions William and Kate themselves were experiencing. The international response was swift and varied. Commonwealth leaders found themselves in the awkward position of commenting on what was essentially a private family matter that had massive political implications. The American president offered diplomatic support, while European royalty maintained careful silence, perhaps recognizing that similar pressures existed in their own lives. Social media exploded with opinions that ranged from supportive to savage. The hashtag documenting the announcement became the most trending topic globally within an hour. Memes, analysis, and conspiracy theories spread faster than any official palace statement could hope to control. The narrative was slipping away from William and Kate, becoming public property to be shaped by millions of individual interpretations. Back in the press room, Kate fielded a question about their children with such grace and fierce protectiveness that even the most cynical reporters found themselves moved. She made it clear that while she and William had chosen to open their lives to public scrutiny, their children deserved to grow up with as much normalcy as possible. The maternal strength in her voice reminded everyone that beneath the royal titles, she was first and foremost a mother protecting her family. William's final statement was perhaps the most powerful moment of the entire press conference. He spoke directly to the British people, acknowledging their disappointment and confusion while asking for understanding and patience. He reminded them that the monarchy was not just about perfection and fairy tales, but about service, duty, and the very human struggle to do what is right, even when the path forward is unclear. As they left the press room together, Kate stumbled, slightly exhaustion and emotion finally taking their toll. William caught her arm, and in that small gesture, photographers captured something that no amount of royal protocol could manufacture: genuine care and partnership in the face of overwhelming adversity. The door closed behind them with a soft click, but the reverberations of what had just happened would continue to echo for months, perhaps years to come. They had opened the door to their private world, and now they would have to live with the consequences of that choice, whatever they might be. The hours following the press conference felt like living in the eye of a hurricane. Inside the palace, an eerie calm had settled over William and Kate, the kind of peace that comes after a long-held secret is finally released into the world. But outside, the storm was just beginning to build its true strength. Kate sat in their private sitting room, still wearing the dress she had chosen so carefully that morning, now wrinkled from the stress and emotion of the day. She stared at her phone, watching as news alerts flooded in from every corner of the globe. The story had transcended royal news and become something bigger, a meditation on marriage, duty, and the cost of living under constant public scrutiny. William paced the room, his formal jacket long since discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up in a rare display of informality. He was fielding calls from family members, government officials, and palace staff, each conversation requiring a different version of the same explanation. The weight of leadership meant he couldn't simply focus on his own emotional needs. He had to consider how their decision would affect everyone connected to the royal family. The children had been taken to a secure location outside London, away from the media frenzy that was building around the palace. Kate felt their absence like a physical ache, knowing they needed protection, but hating that their family was being fractured by circumstances beyond their control. The innocence she had worked so hard to preserve for them had been damaged, perhaps irreparably. Television news channels had abandoned their regular programming entirely, bringing in relationship experts, royal historians, and constitutional scholars to analyze every word, gesture, and implication of the afternoon's announcement. The coverage was relentless, dissecting their marriage with the intensity usually reserved for international crises or natural disasters. Public reaction was as divided as William and Kate had feared it would be. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace, some holding signs of support while others demanded explanations or expressed their disappointment more forcefully. The police had to establish barriers to maintain order, transforming the usually peaceful ceremonial heart of London into something resembling a protest zone. Letters and messages poured into the palace from around the world. Some were angry, accusing them of selfishness and a failure of duty. Others were deeply supportive, sharing personal stories of marriage struggles and praising their courage in speaking openly about difficult truths. The most moving messages came from people who saw their own struggles reflected in the royal couple's admission of imperfection. International headlines told the story in dozens of languages, each culture interpreting the announcement through its own lens of expectation and tradition. In some countries, their honesty was praised as refreshingly modern. In others, it was seen as a dangerous precedent that threatened the very foundation of monarchical authority. Kate finally spoke, her voice hoarse from hours of silence. She talked about the loneliness of their position, how the very pedestal the public had placed them on had become a prison that isolated them from genuine human connection. The irony wasn't lost on her that, in trying to be perfect representatives of their nation, they had become increasingly disconnected from the real struggles of ordinary people. William joined her on the sofa, and for the first time that day they sat together in comfortable silence. The decision had been made, the announcement delivered, and now they faced the long process of living with the consequences. There would be investigations, parliamentary discussions, and endless media analysis. But the hardest part, the telling of their truth, was behind them. The palace staff worked through the night, managing the logistics of a crisis no protocol manual had ever covered. Security was increased, press schedules were torn up and rewritten, and contingency plans activated for scenarios that ranged from public demonstrations to constitutional challenges. The machinery of the monarchy, tested by scandals before, adapted, once again to protect the institution even as its most visible representatives struggled with very human problems. As midnight approached, Kate looked out the window at the lights of London spreading into the distance. Somewhere out there, millions of people were going to sleep with a different understanding of the royal family than they had woken up with. The fairy tale was over, but perhaps something more honest and ultimately more meaningful could take its place. William's phone buzzed with a message from his brother, brief but supportive, reminding them both that family loyalty ran deeper than public opinion. In the morning, there would be more questions, more analysis, and more consequences to face, but tonight they could finally sleep without the weight of their secret pressing down on them. 3 months after the announcement that shook the world, William stood once again at the window of his study, but this time the view looked different. The protesters had long since dispersed, the media circus had moved on to other stories, and London had returned to its normal rhythm. But the changes set in motion by that single moment of truth continued to ripple outward in ways no one had anticipated. Kate had found her voice in the aftermath of their revelation. No longer constrained by the need to maintain a perfect facade, she had begun speaking openly about mental health, the challenges of motherhood in the public eye, and the importance of authenticity in leadership. Her approval ratings after an initial dip had climbed higher than ever before. The British people, it seemed, preferred their royalty human. The children had adapted with the resilience that only young minds possess. Their initial confusion, had given way to a deeper understanding of their parents' courage. They still attended the same schools, still played with the same friends, but they carried themselves with a new awareness of the difference between public perception and private reality. In many ways, they seemed freer than they had before. William's relationship with his father had evolved in unexpected ways. The initial tension and disappointment had gradually given way to deeper conversations about duty, service, and the changing nature of monarchy in the modern world. 3 generations of royal experience were finding common ground in the recognition that adaptation was essential for survival. The constitutional implications had been less dramatic than the most dire predictions suggested. Parliament had debated, scholars had written lengthy analyses, and the Commonwealth governments had issued carefully worded statements, but the foundations of the monarchy remained solid. If anything, the institution seemed strengthened by the demonstration that even its most prominent members were capable of growth and change. Public opinion polls showed a fascinating shift in how people viewed the royal family. The fairy tale expectations had been replaced by something more complex but potentially more durable. Respect for their service combined with understanding of their humanity. The change had been painful but ultimately liberating for everyone involved. Kate had started a foundation focused on supporting families dealing with the pressures of public life, drawing from her own experience to help others navigate similar challenges. Her first public speech since the announcement had been met with a standing ovation, not for her royal status but for her courage in addressing difficult truths. The media landscape had changed too. The old model of deference mixed with intrusion had given way to more thoughtful coverage that recognized the difference between legitimate public interest and invasive curiosity. Some publications had actually apologized for their role in creating the pressures that had led to the crisis. International observers noted that the British monarchy's handling of the situation had set a new standard for transparency and accountability in royal institutions worldwide. Other royal families were quietly taking notes, recognizing that the old model of absolute privacy and perfect public presentation might no longer be sustainable in the digital age. William found himself more effective in his official duties, no longer burdened by the energy required to maintain a false image. His interactions with the public felt more genuine, his speeches more heartfelt, and his charitable work more personally meaningful. The authenticity he had been afraid would diminish his authority had actually enhanced it. As evening fell over London, Kate joined William at the window where this journey had begun. They watched the city lights twinkle to life, each one representing someone whose life had been touched in some small way by their decision to choose truth over comfort. The cost had been high, but the freedom was invaluable. Their children burst into the room, full of stories from their day at school, their laughter filling the space with the kind of joy that had been missing for too long. The family that had almost been torn apart by the weight of expectations had found a new way to be whole. The door William had opened that day had led not to the destruction many had feared, but to a different kind of palace, one with room for imperfection, growth, and genuine human connection. The fairy tale was over, but the real story, with all its complexity and possibility, was just beginning. Outside, London hummed with its eternal energy, and somewhere in the distance, Big Ben chimed the hour, marking another moment in a monarchy that had learned once again how to evolve while honoring the best of its past. The nation's grief had transformed into something deeper and more sustaining, understanding, acceptance, and hope for what authentic leadership could accomplish. In an increasingly complex world,